So continue with our technical program. We have Dr. Behnam Jafarpour from the University of Southern California.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking Energi Simulation for bringing us together in Rio. And unfortunately, I don't have a video to show you. So it's not quite exciting to follow that video with a presentation. I understand that. So, but that's the program. So I'm gonna go ahead and start. I'm the chair in the Energi Simulation that works on subsurface energy data science. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we do under this program. And the second part, which is the main part of my presentation, would focus on some of the recent projects that we've been involved in. So the SHARE program is really at the interface of subsurface flow physics, data science, basically AI and machine learning combined with domain knowledge, and system theory, estimation and control. And you've seen plots like this in the early morning session from Dennis' presentation. And I'll be showing something similar, but with a very different perspective and different kind of work that we do in this area. So some of the key research direction in my lab is description and characterization of complex geosystems. Typically, we build geological systems very complex, and typically we tend to build very large model, high resolution model, because we want high fidelity simulation. The approach we take in a lot of workflows is try to simplify things, and that's where a lot of our focus goes to, how to simplify both in terms of description and in terms of dynamics and in terms of the workflows that we need to develop for them. The second area is using these simplified descriptions, how do we deal with dynamics, monitoring this system, collecting data, integrating those data into their models that we have, and then quantifying uncertainty. And all of this effort goes into field development management, basically trying to make better decisions in terms of developing and managing the field. Typically, that involves optimization, one of the workflows that I will discuss. And it's for that reason that we need to have efficient models and to the extent possible, as close of a model or predictive model to the simulation models that we use in industry. And then finally, data science. That's where basically we use advances in AI and machine learning in order to accomplish some of the goals that we set forward here in terms of developing those tools that can improve efficiency and help with decision support and prediction. So in terms of application area, in the lab we have had projects across 4 different applications, from conventional reservoir to unconventional reservoirs, geothermal, and more recently geologic CO2 storage. This last part is very relevant to the video that we saw. And very recently, we had a kickoff for a National Science Foundation Center, which is a collaboration between USC and Penn State with our School of Engineering collaborating with the School of Earth Science at Penn State. And this is part of the industry university cooperative research centers within NSF that brings together government, university and industry to put together the resources and work on challenging problems that industry faces in a particular topic. And by industry, I really mean different sectors. And this particular area of CO2 storage, the center is focusing on modeling, analytics, and risk reduction technologies. And as I mentioned, this is a collaborative effort. So we have close to 15 faculty involved in the center with very diverse set of expertise and experience. Then the projects that we define for the center are across the 2 campuses, typically involving multiple PIs and multiple PhD students working on those projects. And the topic areas that we define for the center are based on feedback from industry people like yourself, but these are specifically people who are in our advisory board, and they provide funding to support the research. And finally, we have an upcoming meeting, industry advisory board meeting. If you're attending ATCE and you're interested in the topic, you can come and see me. This is our second meeting of the year, where we focus on project presentation and progress report, as well as discussing future directions. All right, before I begin my technical presentation, I have two PhD students here presenting posters related to CO2 storage monitoring, imaging, and prediction using data from the field and simulation models. So with that, now I can go and talk about the actual topic of the presentation, which is subsurface flow data assimilation in deep learning-based low-dimensional latent spaces. So everything I'm going to talk about is basically toward leveraging deep learning, specifically low-dimensional representations in deep learning, in order to deal with complexities of reservoir description and reservoir dynamics. And at the end, I'll show you a couple of examples how we use this framework for data assimilation. So starting with reservoir simulation itself, some of the challenges that we have, a lot of the work that we do is really the inverse problem of this, where we look at data, try to understand reservoirs. But a lot of workflows depend on reservoir simulation to actually give us predictive models. The challenges we have in this area are nonlinearity and complexity of the physics that is involved, large-scale models that we build, and computational costs associated with reservoir simulation, as well as uncertainty around inputs that we need in order to be able to build and run these models. So what I'm showing here on the right-hand side, this is a physical reservoir. It could be reservoir, wells, facilities, everything that we have and we need to model. And typically what we do, we build based on the base available data and knowledge a simulation model for that. This is basically step 1 and 2 in this field development management workflow. Then we have workflows associated with monitoring and updating our models, as well as uncertainty quantification. And finally, with updated models, we want to have updated decisions. And that's what we do with basically formulation of control kind of and optimization workflows. So what we aim to do, and we've been working in this area for the past 10, 15 years, but more recently, our focus has been on, can we replace this reservoir simulation model with something that is a lot more efficient, but is capable of doing the same thing, or almost the same thing? Because in a lot of these workflows, we're going to end up running this simulation hundreds, if not thousands of times. And that's why we need to kind of make the process efficient and practical for field application. So I'll show you a typical example just for illustration purposes. A reservoir simulation model, some field data. There's the physics that's connecting the field data to your simulation model. And we usually go through this, what we call inverse modeling, history matching, with several names for that, in order to update these models in order to match our field data. Given the complexity of these data, as well as the limited content of the data that field models, as well as the limited content of the data that we have, this process presents several challenges. So typically, those challenges can be characterized into 2 categories: reservoir descriptions, problems associated with describing the reservoir, and second, reservoir dynamics, because each of them will give us different challenges to deal with. In terms of reservoir description, we have to deal with the complexity of our reservoir models, the realism of any kind of geological model updating that we do, because there's a geology who wants answers that make sense. And then we have to deal with dimensionality resolution, because there's a discrepancy between the resolution of the data and the resolution of the model that you build. And then on top of all of that, there's a lot of uncertainty about geology and the geological scenarios that are presented to us. On the reservoir dynamics side, we have, again, the dimensionality issue and the computational side, the very time-consuming simulation time, as well as fidelity and error, how representative our models are compared to reality. So those are some of the challenges we have to contend with. And I'll address this first looking at simplifying the complexity in the reservoir, especially when it comes to updating these models and the kind of data that we have to work with. So geological models or reservoir simulation models in general tend to have very high resolution. But oftentimes, the content of the data doesn't allow us to actually do updates at that resolution. So there is a long list of studies in this area to actually try to reduce these kind of models. This is just one layer of SP10 model for those of you who are familiar with that. And from very early work on zonation kind of approaches to more recent approaches looking at compact representation based on sparse signal processing and image processing techniques. But the state of the art nowadays is really deep learning models. And deep learning models have been demonstrated as far more superior in terms of being able to handle that task. So the idea here is that any complex model that you have, if you have various kind of representation of these models, you can feed it into a deep learning model. And there are various architectures that you can use in this area. This is just for illustration. This is the convolutional autoencoder, variational flavor of that. And what it does is basically try to learn the features that are present in your model and try to actually compactly represent them in an abstract manifold. We refer to that in my presentation, I call that latent space, where the dimensionality is significantly reduced to the point that instead of hundreds of thousands of pixels that you have to deal with in the reservoir model, you're dealing with potentially tens of parameters to adjust. In the meantime, you're able to actually update, if you have, in this case, a fluvial system, you're able to actually update these fluvial channels and move them around until you get a good match to your data when you use that in a history matching context. And then it usually involves an encoder on the left side to bring you to that latent space, and a decoder that would take you from the latent space back to the original domain. In the process, there would be a small loss involved also, approximation. So one of the interesting aspects of these deep learning models is that they have a lot of capacity for learning. What that means is that depending on how you set up the structure, the architecture of these models, in fact, you could have multiple geological scenarios fed into these models, and what the model can handle is actually try to approximate various diverse set of geological scenarios and give you lower dimensional representations that involve all of those. And one of the interesting aspects that we have observed is that you actually get to see in the latent space, you get to see some clustering of these geological scenarios where you can actually see, depending on what kind of pattern you have in the geological scenario, they tend to cluster in one area. And that can be leveraged in terms of reducing uncertainty based on additional information that you might have. So we have actually taken advantage of these properties in some of our past publications. So the idea here is that if you have this kind of simplified descriptions, then you can go back to that workflow and replace this pixel-based representation of your reservoir model with a much more effective representation that has several advantages in terms of being able to do this inverse modeling problem in a way that is geologically consistent, accounts for uncertainty, etc. So that's the kind of simplifying the reservoir description. Now I'm going to move on to reservoir dynamics. So in this case, what we do, we take these models and we run simulations, often very costly, and we try to predict output from these models in terms of saturation, pressure, basically a spatial and temporal evolution of quantities of interest for us. And oftentimes for computationally intensive workflows, you need to replace that with something that's a lot more efficient. So the type of architecture that, deep learning architecture that you can put together in order to kind of mimic this behavior, it follows a similar structure that I showed for basically the autoencoder model, where you have an encoder. Think of an encoder that basically mapping whatever we have in the spatial domain to that manifold, low-dimensional manifold, the latent space that we want to work in. And then there is the low-dimensional latent space dynamics now. So there would be this part that would be responsible to propagating information forward in time, and the propagated information will be mapped back through a decoder back to the original space where you can recover pressure, saturation, distribution, etc. Right? So it's a very simple architecture, but very powerful. So the way we put this together is that now the focus is not really the encoder and decoder. Those are just bringing us to the latent space. The focus here is now actually propagating the dynamics in the low-dimensional latent space. And that's where we actually try to bring some innovation, beginning by using standard architectures that we have and moving toward integration of physics and additional domain knowledge to make this more robust. So if you look at what we do with reservoir simulation, we have some inputs in terms of control, in terms of reservoir description, and the parameters that we have into the simulator. And then we get some outputs in time, right? Outputs from the well, outputs from basically the distribution in space and time. And then we keep doing that, right, for the next time step and the time step after that. So we want to use this architecture as exactly in the same fashion. So we set it up to basically take those information. The first thing you do is bring that to the latent space, which involves an encoding. And that's what is shown in here. Same thing with our controls and with our parameters. Then the processing that is happening in here, this will be done during training of these networks so that they understand what is happening coming from the spatial domain to the latent space and how that information is propagated forward. So in the same fashion that I showed for reservoir simulation, we actually march in time in the latent space, and in a much more efficient way than a reservoir simulation will do. So what you see at the end, when you train an architecture like this, you basically have this box, which is interfacing with the spatial, the real original domain that we are interested in, both in terms of control inputs, in terms of the output that we have for quantities of interest. So what we need to learn through this process is encoder-decoder kind of architectures, as well as the dynamics that's taking place in the latent. And all of that is taken care of during the training. So these are the two maps that would basically be used as interface with the original domain. So what we have done with this is, in one of our studies by one of my PhD students, we have actually gone into this this is an example of these type of cells that I was showing you for propagating information. Instead of simple matrix vector products that we have within these architectures, we actually followed the structure of the fluid flow equations. And the idea here was that to help the network understand, we are trying to model fluid flow. This is not just generalized matrix vector operation. So, and that we showed in the paper that is listed here. Okay, what we showed here is actually that made a big difference in terms of robustness of our prediction, quality of our prediction, and the ability to predict far into the future. So coming back to the diagram I showed at the beginning, now what we want to do with this is we want to bring our encoder-decoder architecture as an interface between what we want, where we want to be in the latent space, and what the actual data is coming from, which is the original space, the reservoir itself. And what we do here is that the workflow that I showed for estimation or data assimilation, history matching, and the workflow for control, all of that is taking place in the latent space. So everything is projected into a latent space where all of these workflows are taking place, and we implement those in a much more efficient way than is done using reservoir simulation in the original domain. So I'll show you a couple of examples and end my talk here. So this is a typical data assimilation framework, ensemble Kalman filter or ESMDA, variations of it. So you start with a bunch of initial models, and you go through this forecast and update steps with the hope of using the data to update your models to get better models. So what we've done here is that we have trained an architecture that, using this encoding and decoding, will bring us from basically those original description into the latent space representation. I haven't really discussed some of the properties and advantages we gain is that a lot of times these descriptions are distributionally are much simpler. For example, most of the time you get Gaussian distribution out of these encoders in the latent space, which makes the data integration process far simpler. And then this is the block that does latent space data assimilation. And once we are done, we project everything back to the original domain. We get the updated maps. And if you want, we get the predictions. So this is a little bit of details, how this actually works. And these are the kind of updates that are happening in the latent space. Instead of those larger scale models that we need to update, we are really updating probably tens of variables that have very simple distributions. So here's an example from a Wolf model from North Sea showing this is the reference case for this study. This is the block where the data assimilation is happening. And on the right-hand side, what you see are the initial models and the updated models. And when you look at basically the result, the dots are showing the data, the actual data, and the gray lines are showing the prior forecast, and the colors, depending on what kind of variable you have, water, oil, gas, you'll see that the blue versus green, the prediction are getting closer to the data as a result of data assimilation. Another example here is from geological CO2 storage. What we're showing in here is a cross-section. This is the permeability around an injection well. And what you see is how the plume is evolving from the simulation. And these are some prior samples showing different distribution than the reference model. And according to those distributions, these are saturation plots that at a snapshot after 15 years, the saturation plots obviously are different from what you have in the reference model. The goal is, if you had 4D seismic of this snapshot as a very coarse scale, could we actually use that to update our initial samples to get better models? And just a summary of the result, this is when we actually operate in the original domain. So these are the reference. This is just a reference model. This is showing the prior distribution, the mean, variance, and a couple of samples. This is if you actually implement the data assimilation in the original space. We end up with overestimation, underestimation of uncertainty, so the variance is almost zero. These samples are very close to each other. And then when we implement that in the latent space, we actually get a more reasonable uncertainty around it, and the updates are generally better than what we get from the original space. And then this is the corresponding saturation plots for implementation in the original space versus in the latent space. I've just highlighted some of the key features that in the latent space you're able to capture. So in summary, the takeaway message is that deep learning latent spaces offer really an opportunity to go in there and try to much more efficiently describe reservoir dynamics. That will give you basically the chance to develop very fast proxy models that will be very helpful for a lot of the workflows that we need to implement. One of the interesting aspects is adaptivity to construct fit for purpose. Depending on how data dependent or how physics dependent you want to be, you can actually work in that latent space to enforce some of those constraints that you're interested in. And in terms of field management workflow, using the latent space, you could actually implement these workflows much more efficiently than you would otherwise be able to do in the original domain. And the key here is really simplifying the complexities that exist in reservoir description and reservoir dynamics. And with that, I think that's my last slide. I thank the sponsors, including Energi Simulation, and my students, my lab, for helping with the work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jafarpour. Questions from the floor?
Thank you. So currently, let's say that we have a complex geological model with facies, a relationship between facial porosity and probability, and we want to keep its representation on your posterior model. So the first question is, are you using 3D convolution to get these?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I didn't go through the details of these architectures, but yes, the convolutional operator is a 3D convolutional operator. Yeah.
Yes. And although the latent space is very small, might be very small, the calculation in order to get that degrees, it takes a lot of space regarding GPU. So what's the limitation that we have currently, for instance, to get a model that has 300,000 cells with multiple properties, including faces, in order of hardware, let's say?
So that's a very good point. So being in academia, we don't have access to large scale computing GPUs. So what we focus on are problems at a scale where we can handle. But obviously, if you want to do this at a field scale models, let's say you have millions of grid blocks, then the computation for that and the infrastructure you need for that will scale up accordingly, right? But what we see, the most important aspect that we see in our studies is the fact that how much simplification can be done of very complex architecture, very complex models that we build, and how these dynamics can be propagated in time at a lower dimension, with a lower dimensional representation. So in terms of exact numbers, if I want to give you, we are not working with those numbers, millions of grid. What I showed you, the Wolf field is probably around 50, 60,000 grid blocks. Those we can handle, the infrastructure that we have. But of course, the training of this, that's another point you made. The training of this can be computationally intensive, but it's all happening offline. So you can do this offline and bring it online and do fast prediction.
Okay, yeah. Once that latent space is trained, I think the overall workflow, but the main bottleneck now would be the training of the latent space then.
Yes, and one of the challenges there, and we have published a couple of papers on this, one of the challenges there is that at some point you don't want to be too data dependent, meaning that you don't want to generate a million size of data set to train these models. So the key for us is bringing physics to help us. Basically, data is an issue in our field, and in order to address that, one area that we are focusing on is actually getting into these architectures and trying to help the network by injecting information into it. That's we call domain knowledge. But that's an active area of research for us in our group. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
What question there?
Thank you. Good, very good presentation. All these deep learning method approaches, there have a lot of parameters involved. So how many simulations do you need to compute your latent spaces for your both problems?
That's also a very good question. So there's a level of kind of art involved in designing this architecture, tuning them, and making sure they run okay. But that comes with experience. But a lot of times, in terms of number of samples we use for the scale of models that we have, we can get away with a few hundred, sometimes maybe 800, 900 samples. We get very good results. But in terms of the effort that it takes to put together the architecture and train them, there are so many tuning parameters you have to deal with. But oftentimes, after PhD students, after a few months of working with this model, they get very good at how to adjust those parameters and how to tune them.
I have another question. We do this kind of thing in other kind of simulations, and we do not use deep learning because of this drawback of deep learning that requires a lot of simulations. Did you decide to use deep learning approaches and not other methods that are simpler to get latent spaces because of the stochastic way to provide the geological model?
So one of the advantages we see with deep learning There are several, but one of the main advantages is generalizability. How generalizable are these models? How much uncertainty you can load on them, right? There are other proxy development approaches where you can simplify the models and you can work with a low-dimensional representation, but the amount of diversity in terms of scenarios you can provide would be very limited. Otherwise, the prediction accuracy will go down significantly. What we are noticing is adaptivity and generalizability of these architecture. Adaptivity in the sense that the amount of physics versus the amount of data you want to incorporate is really up to you. You have a knob to decide about that, right? And in terms of generalizability, is you don't have to worry too much about having multiple different scenarios that are being used at the same time to train these models. They're very good. They have a lot of capacity for learning, and they're very good at compartmentalizing what scenario is being used. And if that scenario is being called, they know where to go and collect that information. So these are some of the very powerful features that we find in these kind of architectures.